Hello everybody, I'm Connor Mountford. I'm a senior majoring in political science here at Fort Hays State, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about legislative professionalism and how it affects representation in state legislatures. So to get started, I kind of want to talk about what is legislative professionalism. There are three factors that play into legislative professionalism. The first one being session length. So how many days are you working? How many days are legislators actually on the job? How long do their sessions last? So there's two ways that people typically calculate this. The first one being session days, the other one just being calendar days. So calendar days would just be the amount of time you're actually in the Capitol, you're there, how long the session lasts. That takes into like weekends, stuff like that, recesses. It doesn't give a good representation of how many days legislators are actually on the job. So for this study, I used your actual legislative days, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the methodology section. The second factor that affects professionalism is pay. So how much are you making? Are you making enough where you can be a full-time legislator, or do you have to have another job to supplement your income? Remember, this is at the state legislative level, so a lot of state legislators don't make very much money. For instance, in Kansas, our legislators make $88 a day. So that's roughly $20,000 a year. Not really enough for you to live on as your sole source of income. And then finally, the number of full-time staff that a legislator has at their disposal. So legislators are busy people, and they have a lot of issues that they are expected to be knowledgeable about. And so having staff that are experts in a policy area or several policy areas give them kind of the latitude to be able to do their job better. They can, instead of having to themselves do in-depth research on a topic that they might not know a whole lot about, in addition to having their daily meetings and briefings and so on and so forth, they also have, they would have to research this stuff, so they have full-time staff members that can kind of jump in and do some of that research, and that way they have more time to make votes, visit with constituents, kind of do their job other than just researching. And it's important to note here that professionalism is different from careerism. So we hear a lot about, I guess I should back up here, we hear a lot about careerism in politics, being like how long somebody serves, that, oh, they've been in the legislature for 14 years or 18 years. That's kind of separate from professionalism. Professionalism is just how close legislature is to being like a full-time job. So how long you're there, how much support you have, and how much you get paid. Moving on to representation, I looked at three different factors of representation in state legislatures, those being your education level, your sex, so male, female, and then race. And for education level, I looked at people below a high school degree, to high school graduates, and then some college and bachelor's degree or higher. And race, I just used the census demographics for race, and you guys will be able to see those here in just a second. So the point of this, what I was looking at, is does professionalism affect the representation of these three variable groups in state legislatures? So is it a structural barrier of how your legislature is set up, of whether, say, somebody working at McDonald's as opposed to being a lawyer can be in the legislature realistically? And where this kind of came from was, like I said, if you have a huge time commitment and being a legislator, you're not getting paid very much, and you don't have much staff to support you, it's unrealistic that you're going to, just logically thinking about it, unrealistic that you're going to be able to take time away from your job without and stay employed, take time away from your job, keep employment, and be able to be a legislator. If you had to quit your job to be a legislator, then you're not making enough money to have a living wage. So you have to have some other form of income. So the idea was that some of these things would that it would provide a structural barrier to the representation of some of these variable groups in state legislatures. So kind of my hypothesis was that there would be a direct positive relationship between legislative professionalism and representation of minority groups in state legislatures. So in other words, that as your legislature gets more professionalized, minority group representation more closely mirrors their representation in the general population. Second, that there would be a direct positive relationship between education level and representation in state legislatures. So the same concept here, that as your legislature gets more professionalized, it would be more representative of the breakdown of different education levels among the general population. And then finally, that there is no relationship between legislative professionalism and sex representation in state legislatures. So, kind of a little more information on the background of why I thought these things would be barriers. If you look at the occupation types and the average income, and then also the percentage of the race groups that are in these income levels, you can see that there is a pretty high percentage of everybody that is management and occupation, but there's also a pretty high percentage of minority groups that are in other service-related, in other industries that are pay less than management and occupation groups. So, moving on to the methodology, how did I test this? I used what's called the Squire Index, and so basically what that is was this guy Peveril Squire, kind of a cool name. But this guy Peveril Squire was looking at this concept of legislative professionalism, and was like, okay, this is really weird. I can't figure out, like, why can't anybody agree on a definition of this? Clearly state legislatures are structured differently, but we can't figure out kind of like why it is that nobody can agree on what professionalism is, which gets at kind of that professionalism, careerism dichotomy. So what he did was he kind of looked historically at the progressive movement and some of these reforms that have happened in state legislatures, and saw that most of the reforms in state legislatures were moving the structural, the institutional makeup of the legislature to more closely mirror that of the U.S. Congress. So having longer session lengths, the U.S. Congress has averaged 138 days session lengths since the 1970s. More staff in Congress. Senators get about roughly 34 staff members per senator and 14 staff members per member of the House of Representatives, and higher pay. So roughly in the U.S. Congress, it's about $174,000 a year. So what he did was took those three factors, session length, pay, and number of full-time support staff, created an index from 0 to 1 to measure how closely they are related to Congress, and then that would be how professional you are. So let's say you're 0.81, then you're pretty close to being like Congress, your legislature is. If you're 0.25, you're pretty far away. And then I just ran correlation between the professionalism score created by Peveril Squire and each of the difference between the representation in the general population and the state legislature for each of my variable groups. And this kind of brings us to the interesting part, the conclusions of, so does this matter? Is it a structural barrier? The answer, no, it's not. The correlations were so small on just about everything except for bachelor's degree or higher, that they're not statistically significant. There's obviously a minor correlation. It's close to having statistical significance on a couple of the subvariable groups, but there is an actual statistical significance to all but one. And what that means is basically that it is not a structural barrier. There is underrepresentation of those groups still in state legislatures across the board for just about every state legislature in the country, but it is not as very strongly affected by the structural makeup of the state legislature. So while it is a little disappointing that, for me personally, that all my hypotheses were false, it still gets interesting results of that. There's got to be some other factor that is playing into this of why there is underrepresentation of these groups in state legislatures. And so moving forward, for other people who are interested in doing research, if any of you, big crowd here, I know you guys might be interested doing some of this. I know I see a couple juniors, sophomores out there maybe want to do some stuff. But maybe look at something like the cultural makeup or the cultural identity of the state, the ideology of the state, instead of the structural makeup of the state legislature. Because as we see here, it's kind of a non-factor. So with that, does anybody have any questions for me? Jackie?
How did you get interested in this for your thesis?
So in a state politics class I had last semester, in the fall semester, we started studying kind of the history of Kansas state politics and the makeup of the Kansas state legislature. And that led me to this fun website, the National Conference of State Legislatures, that kind of does a professionalization score, their own scoring system, and ranks the professionalization of legislatures. Thought that was kind of interesting, started looking at it. We had an assignment at the end of that class that was compare the state legislative makeup of Kansas and the states surrounding Kansas. Found out that their methods of calculating this score were kind of weird, and decided to look more into it. So, any other questions?
I would just guess that the makeup of Kansas, I mean, we don't have a lot of Hawaiian or Hispanic or, well, Asian. I mean, we have some, obviously, but our makeup of the Kansas legislation body is maybe indicative of what Kansas is.
Right, and that's where there was underrepresentation across the board of minority groups, but like you said, for a lot of these, it was that there were in the population 0 Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders and then 0 Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in the legislature. So that was accurate, but say for like Hispanic or Latino or African American and Black people, then those were underrepresented just about across the board for every state.
And it was interesting, so there's nobody that's less than a high school graduate.
Actually, there was no data on that, interestingly.
Okay.
So the data that I found for the education level for state legislatures was 2015 data, and the data was other. So it started at high school graduate, and then it had other. And so what is other? And I didn't really know, is other less than high school graduate? It could be something else. It could be GED or so on and so forth. So I just left less than high school graduate blank because the data wasn't there for it.
Because I'm guessing, is it the rules in Kansas, do you have to at least have a GED?
No.
Not even a GED?
There's no education requirement in Kansas.
That says a lot.
Yeah. Interestingly, up until I think last year, for the governorship, there was no age requirement. There was no residency requirement. We had a dog file to run for governor in Kansas. But that has been changed now, luckily. I'm sure you all remember the 6 or 7 high schoolers we had running. But Does anybody have anything else?
Do you know the parameters? What kind of parameters have we set? Do you have to graduate from high school? Can you have a GED? Can you be in high school?
There is no education requirement. There is an age requirement of 18.
You have to be
now.
human?
Yes, you do have to be human. You have to be an 18-year-old human now
Okay.
to be able to run. So that's just about it. No education required.
So we could have future governors right here in this room.
We could, yeah.
Okay.
Anything else? Seeing nothing, then that's all I have for you guys.